December 27th, 2025. The Southern Caribbean seemed calm, almost too calm. With only a few days left in the year, commercial traffic was heavy. Fishing boats followed familiar routes. Cargo vessels stayed in steady lanes. On the surface, it looked like an ordinary transit window, the kind many assume comes with lower military tension. That assumption was exactly what Venezuela appeared to be counting on. From Caracas, the timing likely seemed perfect. Late December, holiday rotations, end-of-year fatigue, a belief that U.S. Navy crews, like everyone else, might be operating at a slightly lower rhythm, not careless, just predictable. That was the theory. At 6:18 local time, it started to fall apart. High above the water, U.S. Navy sensors detected a shift in the surface picture. 6 separate contacts, previously spread apart, were now aligning. Speed increased, headings tightened. What had been little more than background noise on radar suddenly began to look like an organized formation. This was not random, and it was not civilian traffic. Inside the carrier's Combat Information Center, the picture came into focus quickly. Hull signatures matched Venezuelan naval vessels. Displacement, radar activity, maneuver patterns, all of it was familiar. These were not ships drifting too close by chance. They were moving with purpose. Closest point of approach calculations updated in real time. The numbers dropped, then dropped again. On the bridge, there were no raised voices and no sudden turns. The aircraft carrier held course and maintained speed, exactly as doctrine requires. Because December does not change procedure. The U.S. Navy does not switch to a holiday mindset. Readiness does not rise and fall with the calendar. Watch rotations remain fixed. Alert conditions stay standardized. Every transit, whether in July or in late December, is handled the same way by design. That was the first major misread. At 6:24, bridge-to-bridge radio calls were transmitted. Professional, clear, first in English, then in Spanish. Standard maritime warnings identified a U.S. Navy warship conducting lawful operations in international waters. No response came back. The 6 Venezuelan ships kept closing in. Their formation then split into 2 elements, a classic pressure move. One group shifted toward the carrier's port side, the other angled toward starboard. Not an encirclement, not yet, but close enough to test reaction limits. Inside the strike group, the tactical picture widened. Escort destroyers adjusted positions slightly, not to threaten, but to improve coverage. Air search radars shifted focus. Surface tracks were refined down to individual wake patterns. Every speed change, every rudder input from the approaching ships was logged. Still, the carrier did not turn. This is the part many people outside the military often misunderstand. A ship holding steady does not mean it is unprepared. In U.S. Navy doctrine, maintaining course under pressure is not passivity. It is control. By 6:31, the Venezuelan ships accelerated again. That decision mattered. It pushed the encounter beyond routine proximity and into the territory of deliberate challenge. This was no longer simple shadowing. It had become a test of how close was too close and whether the date on the calendar might buy extra tolerance. It would not. Without fanfare, the next phase began. An MH-60R Seahawk helicopter was brought to alert status. It was configured for surveillance, not escalation. Its mission was straightforward. Eyes forward, documentation non-stop, presence unmistakable. No alarms blared, no dramatic moves followed, but every sailor on watch understood what this moment meant. The Venezuelan Navy had chosen its timing carefully. December 27th, just days before the new year, a moment they believed the U.S. Navy would be least prepared. They were about to find out that preparation does not take holidays, and that calm seas often hide the most dangerous assumptions of all. From a distance, the U.S. aircraft carrier looked alone. That illusion was part of the problem. To anyone watching from miles away, it was a single silhouette cutting through calm Caribbean water. No visible escorts crowding the horizon, no dramatic course changes, no obvious signs of elevated alert, just steel, steady speed, and silence. What the Venezuelan ships could not see was everything behind that calm. By 6:36 local time, the carrier strike group had shifted fully into a layered awareness posture. Not an emergency response, not a chaotic scramble, something far more controlled and far more serious for anyone misreading it. Inside the Combat Information Center, the surface picture was no longer just 6 contacts. It had become a predictive model built from course projections, acceleration trends, and intent analysis. Each Venezuelan vessel was tracked individually. Its behavior was measured against past encounters and known doctrine. Patterns matter, and these patterns were not reassuring. The U.S. Navy does not wait for a visual confrontation before thinking 3 moves ahead. Sensors do that work first. Radar sweeps refine the surface tracks into precise vectors. Electronic support systems logged emissions from Venezuelan radars as they cycled through search modes. Nothing overt, nothing unlawful on its own, but enough to confirm active monitoring. That detail alone changed the tone of the encounter. On the bridge, the carrier stayed on heading without deviation. Speed remained unchanged. The order was simple: show no reaction that could be mistaken for uncertainty. Meanwhile, the strike group quietly made itself known, not visually, but tactically. Escort destroyers adjusted spacing, each movement measured in hundreds of yards rather than miles. Their positions created overlapping coverage zones designed to shield the carrier without advertising their presence. This was not intimidation, it was geometry. Above the formation, the MH-60R Seahawk lifted off. Its departure was smooth and unhurried. To anyone watching through binoculars, it may have looked routine. In reality, its role was exact. The helicopter pushed the carrier's awareness outward, feeding real-time imagery, surface identification, and behavioral confirmation. Every second of video was time-stamped, every bearing logged, every maneuver archived. This was not about drama, it was about record. At 6:41, another set of bridge-to-bridge calls went out. Calm, professional, and direct, repeating safe navigation protocols and again identifying the U.S. Navy carrier's lawful status in international waters. Once again, there was no response. The Venezuelan ships kept closing. Their wake patterns sharpened as speed increased. One vessel moved slightly ahead of the others, taking the role of lead element. Not aggressive enough to trigger an immediate escalation, but assertive enough to make intent clear. Inside the carrier, nobody raised their voice. That silence was not hesitation. It was discipline. The holiday period had not reduced readiness. If anything, it had made the routine even more exact. Watch teams were fully manned. Air crews were rested. Command teams were operating under normal peacetime transit doctrine, the same doctrine built to absorb pressure without overreacting. What Venezuela seems to have missed was this: U.S. Navy readiness does not suddenly surge during a crisis. It stays steady. At 6:47, the Seahawk closed the distance. It held a safe altitude offset from the Venezuelan formation, letting its sensors do the work. Infrared cameras tracked exhaust signatures. Optical systems captured deck activity. Crew movement near forward positions was noted, not as an immediate threat, but as context. No systems were aimed. No visible beams, just observation. This is where miscalculations often begin to multiply. When one side expects a visible reaction and gets none, it may push further, assuming the absence of resistance means the absence of capability. But capability was everywhere. Below the waterline, sonar systems maintained passive awareness. Above it, air search radars swept continuously. Beyond the horizon, data links connected the carrier to a much wider network extending far beyond what the Venezuelan ships could see. From their perspective, it may have looked like 6 naval vessels pressing a single carrier at the end of the year. From the U.S. Navy's perspective, it was a routine pressure scenario, unfolding exactly as trained. And the closer the Venezuelan ships moved, the more obvious one reality became. They were not probing weakness. They were moving deeper into a system designed to record, contain, and outlast them without a single shot being fired. By 6:52 local time, the encounter had reached its turning point. The Venezuelan formation was now close enough that assumptions no longer mattered. Distance was no longer an abstract calculation on a screen. It was visible. It was measurable in overlapping wakes and in the subtle body language of ships that had moved from signaling to pressure. This was the moment when intent either becomes clear or starts to collapse under its own risk. Inside the carrier's Combat Information Center, the assessment was unanimous. The Venezuelan ships had moved beyond passive presence and into deliberate challenge. Not an attack, not yet, but unmistakably unsafe. That distinction matters. Rules of engagement are not built around emotion or optics. They are built around thresholds, and one of those thresholds is proximity combined with behavior. By 6:55, Venezuela had reached it. The MH-60R Seahawk adjusted its orbit. The helicopter descended slightly, maintaining lateral separation while tightening its observational arc. From that position, its sensors delivered uninterrupted high-resolution coverage of the Venezuelan lead ship's bridge, deck activity, and forward positions. Everything was recorded. Everything was time-stamped. This was not intimidation. It was evidence. On the carrier's bridge, posture remained unchanged. Course steady, speed constant. No audible alarms, no visible rush of movement. The message was unmistakable. The U.S. Navy would not be pushed into a reaction. That refusal to react was, in itself, the response. At 6:58, the Seahawk moved to the next step on the escalation ladder, one carefully built to avoid any exchange of fire. A low-powered, non-lethal laser designator flashed on briefly. Its beam swept across the bridge windows of the Venezuelan lead ship, not blinding, not overtly aggressive, but impossible to ignore. Every professional mariner understands the meaning instantly. You are being watched, you are being documented, and you are nearing a boundary with real consequences. At the same time, the helicopter crew sent a direct warning over open maritime frequencies, first in English, then in Spanish. Calm, measured, and unambiguous. You're operating unsafely in international waters. Alter course immediately. For the first time since the encounter began, something changed aboard the Venezuelan ships. Not speed, but posture. Deck crews shifted position. Personnel moved back from the forward gun mount. A figure on the bridge lifted binoculars, paused, then lowered them. Small details? Yes, but at sea, small details often say the most. Inside the carrier strike group, no one relaxed. No one treated it like a win. In many ways, this was the most dangerous phase, the point where pride, politics, and misjudgment can collide without warning. The carrier still did not alter course. That was not stubbornness, it was doctrine. If the carrier had turned under pressure, it would have validated the Venezuelan maneuver. It would have suggested that timing and proximity were enough to influence U.S. movement. That kind of precedent was never going to be accepted. At 7:02, one Venezuelan ship reduced speed. Not dramatically, just enough to register. The formation began to lose its symmetry. The lead vessel drifted slightly off axis. Another started to lag behind by an increasingly noticeable margin. The cohesion that had defined the approach began to crack. That was the moment the challenge failed. Not with noise, not with force, with hesitation. The Seahawk held its position, sensors fixed, saying nothing. The laser did not reappear. The radio remained silent. The U.S. Navy did not press the moment. That restraint mattered because everyone involved understood what had just happened. Venezuela had pushed toward the edge, expecting late December complacency. Instead, it found disciplined silence, layered awareness, and a carrier that refused to treat pressure as leverage. At 7:06, the Venezuelan formation changed course. Not officially a retreat, but no longer an intercept either. The closest point of approach began to widen, slowly at first, then unmistakably. The line had been reached, and Venezuela had chosen not to cross it. No shots were fired, no warnings were intensified, no shouted orders cut through the air, but the message was clear. December the 27th was supposed to be a moment of distraction. Instead, it became a demonstration of something far more dangerous to underestimate. A Navy that does not need escalation to assert control and does not need holidays to remain ready. The encounter was not over, but the result was already clear. By 7:11 local time, the geometry of the situation had shifted. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but enough that anyone who understood the sea could read it immediately. The Venezuelan ships were no longer driving forward. Their headings had softened. Their wake lines, once sharp and converging, were beginning to spread apart. Separation was returning, 1 nautical mile at a time. Inside the U.S. carrier's Combat Information Center, the surface picture updated continuously. Closest point of approach values widened, speed differences normalized. What had been a deliberate challenge only minutes earlier was becoming something else entirely: containment. The carrier strike group did not pursue. It did not close the gap. It did not try to turn the moment into a spectacle. That too was deliberate. In U.S. Navy doctrine, once pressure eases, escalation ends with it. There is no gain in making disengagement look like humiliation. The objective is control, not theater. From the Venezuelan side, this was likely the moment of realization. The holiday assumption had failed. December had not weakened readiness. It had not thinned out watch teams. It had not slowed decisions. Instead, it had revealed a disciplined system operating exactly as designed, indifferent to timing, unmoved by appearances, and resistant to provocation. As the Venezuelan ships widened their distance, the full structure they had underestimated became clearer. The aircraft carrier had never been alone. Escort destroyers, previously masked by range and positioning, now resolved more clearly on radar. Their spacing formed a protective arc that had been there from the beginning, unseen but constant. Above them, the Seahawk remained on station, not as a threat, but as confirmation that every second of the encounter had been captured. Beyond the immediate formation, data links connected the carrier to a much broader operational picture. Surveillance assets outside visual range continued tracking air and surface movement. Nothing about this situation existed in isolation. That realization settled in quietly. At 7:16, one Venezuelan ship made a more obvious course correction. Another followed. The formation no longer looked coordinated. It looked like individual vessels easing back into ordinary patrol headings. No announcement came with the change. No radio transmission explained it. No warning was acknowledged. That too was standard. Navies do not usually admit a miscalculation in real time. They adjust, disengage, and move on. The U.S. carrier maintained course throughout. No victory turn, no signal flare, no added pressure. It continued its transit as though nothing unusual had occurred, because operationally, nothing had happened that the system was not built to absorb. Pressure scenarios are expected, tested, managed. By 7:21, the nearest Venezuelan ship was opening distance at a steady rate, 6 nautical miles, then 7. The risk envelope collapsed back into safe margins. What remained was documentation, analysis, and an encounter that would later be reviewed in quiet rooms far from the water. On the bridge, the tone never changed. Logs were updated, timestamps were verified, sensor recordings were archived. The Seahawk began preparing to return to the deck, its mission complete. The most revealing detail was not what happened, but what never happened. No alarms, no heightened readiness call, no break from doctrine. Venezuela had tested what it believed was a moment of weakness. Instead, it encountered a system built to function without emotional spikes or seasonal slowdowns. That was the reality they failed to see. Readiness is not a surge, it is a baseline. And by the time the Venezuelan ships had fully disengaged, one fact was impossible to miss. Not only for the sailors involved, but for the analysts who would later review every frame and every data point. December 27th had not revealed complacency. It had revealed assumption. The carrier strike group continued southbound, steady and unchanged, leaving behind calm water and a lesson written not in firepower, but in distance regained and pressure dissolved. The encounter was over. The implications were not. By the time the Venezuelan ships fully pulled away, the sea had returned to its earlier calm. No debris, no warning shots, no real-time headlines. From the outside, it might have looked like nothing happened at all. Inside the U.S. Navy system, everything had happened. Every radar sweep, every course correction, every moment of hesitation had already been archived, categorized, and queued for post-mission analysis. Not as drama, not as confrontation, as data. That is where the real outcome of December 27th was decided. For Venezuela, the encounter appears to have been intended as a calculated signal, an end-of-year challenge built on the idea that timing could offset imbalance, that a holiday window could create uncertainty, that carefully applied proximity might provoke a reaction. Instead, it exposed a basic misunderstanding of how the U.S. Navy actually operates. Readiness is not seasonal. There is no holiday posture at sea. Watch rotations do not thin out. Decision chains do not slow down. Doctrine does not pause for calendars or celebrations. The same procedures that apply in midsummer apply on December 27th. The same thresholds govern conduct regardless of appearances. That consistency is not accidental. It exists because a force that only sharpens during visible crisis invites miscalculation during quiet moments. The U.S. Navy is built to avoid exactly that. The Venezuelan ships did not fail because they lacked firepower. They failed because they misread restraint. They took silence for uncertainty. They assumed calm water meant lower vigilance. It did not. What they met was a carrier strike group functioning exactly as trained, absorbing pressure without overreacting, documenting behavior without escalating, and allowing the situation to resolve without forcing a dramatic finish. That kind of response sends a message more lasting than force. At every stage, stronger measures were available. They simply were not needed. No systems were brought to bear. No hard maneuver was imposed. No final line was crossed. And still, control was never really in doubt. That is the lesson of December 27th. In modern naval competition, dominance is not always defined by who acts first. More often, it belongs to the side that controls tempo without needing to fire at all. The side that remains predictable to itself and unreadable to everyone else. Venezuela tried to create leverage through timing. The U.S. Navy answered by refusing to treat timing as a variable. That response matters because when a Navy operates the same way on December 27th as it does on any other day, it denies its rivals the very opening they are hoping to exploit. In the hours that followed, the carrier strike group continued its transit. No mission change, no public statement, no further signal beyond the one already delivered at sea. For the sailors involved, it was logged as another pressure scenario resolved without escalation. For planners and analysts, it became something more. A reminder that miscalculation rarely arrives looking like aggression. More often, it arrives quietly, disguised as confidence in the wrong assumption. December 27th was supposed to offer an advantage. Instead, it became a case study. Not in confrontation, not in force, but in why assuming complacency in a professional Navy is one of the fastest ways to discover there was none. The sea stayed calm. The lesson did not.